welcome to the deep dive. Make sure to like and subscribe right now so you don't miss any of our explorations into the world's most fascinating, complex, and impactful sources.
Yeah,
Today, we are stepping into some highly controversial territory.
we really are.
Yeah, we are embarking on an exclusive, ultra-long, and incredibly incisive review of an explosive 2025 ebook. Whether you're someone trying to map the shifting tectonic plates of our modern cultural landscape, or you're an active part of the men's rights and manosphere communities, this is an exploration you simply cannot afford to miss.
Absolutely.
I want to put this out there right at the top. If the ideas we unpack today hook your interest, you should immediately head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy this book for yourself so you can explore the full, unfiltered text alongside us.
That is exactly right. So the source text we are dissecting today is titled Leftist Wolf Whistles: Bad Faith Arguments, Mott and Bally Policies, Framing Tricks, and Epistemic Evil. And it's written by Conrad Riker. But before we dive into the dense substance of Riker's arguments, we need to issue a very clear, very firm, and mandatory neutrality disclaimer.
Yeah, that's crucial here.
Right. This book contains highly politically charged content. It's provocative by its very design.
Right.
So we want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that as hosts, we are taking absolutely no sides today. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the conclusions found in this text.
Not at all. We are acting strictly as your impartial guides.
Exactly. Our sole mission is to purely convey the ideas contained in the source material so that you can understand the author's underlying thesis. And that thesis is massive. It's an exploration of the history of how our institutions allegedly function before being, and these are entirely the author's words captured by feminists and Marxists.
Right. So we are here to read the map, not to tell you whether or not you should actually move to the territory. To do that, we're going to navigate this dense piece of work by looking at the overarching system Riker describes, which he calls the matrix or the gynocracy.
The gynocracy.
And then we'll examine how he believes that system operates in the real world. We'll look at the specific institutional battlegrounds he highlights, like modern dating, family courts, the education system, and the corporate workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, we'll unpack his proposed solution for men, a concept he calls the alpha reclamation. So let's start with the foundation. In the preface, Riker speaks directly to his male readers, and he immediately flips the script on how men are usually spoken to in mainstream discourse.
He really does.
He tells them they aren't broken, they aren't toxic, and they aren't lacking emotional intelligence. He claims the system itself is designed to drain their time, money, and purpose. So how exactly does he frame this overarching system?
Well, the book immediately reframes the modern male experience by introducing the concept of psychological disarmament. Riker argues that for decades, the mainstream narrative, whether you are looking at modern therapy, the education system, or media representation, has largely suggested that men are inherently flawed.
Right, like they need to be fixed.
Exactly. The prevailing idea is that traditional masculinity is something to be fixed or cured, and that men need to adapt to a standard that is much more emotionally vulnerable and communicative. Riker completely rejects this. He asserts that this constant demand for men to change their fundamental nature is actually a form of psychological warfare.
Wow, warfare. That's a strong word.
According to the text, men are being actively conditioned to apologize for their natural biological instincts. The instinct to lead, to build, to compete, and to protect. He argues that this isn't societal progress. It's a deliberate tactic to weaken men before they even realize they are in a conflict.
Psychological disarmament. It's a striking phrase. It implies a coordinated effort.
Yeah.
But how does a society actually accomplish that on a massive scale?
Well, he points to language.
The book points to how seemingly positive concepts like equality are weaponized to achieve this disarmament. He uses a very specific rhetorical concept to explain how this happens, calling it the Mott and Bally tactic. I know this is a logical fallacy, but can you explain to the listener exactly how Riker applies the Mott and Bally concept to modern gender politics?
Yeah, sure. So to understand the Mott and Bally, you have to picture a medieval castle. The moat is the highly defensible, safe inner keep built up on a hill. The Bally is the highly desirable, fertile land down below where all the actual wealth and resources are, but, and this is key, it is incredibly vulnerable to attack.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
In the context of an argument, someone will make a very radical, controversial claim. That is the Bally. In Riker's framework, the Bally is the push for systemic female supremacy, the deliberate penalizing of men in institutions, and the dismantling of male-only spaces. It's a radical agenda that most people would naturally push back against.
Okay, so they are out in the vulnerable Bally pushing this radical agenda. What happens when someone challenges them?
The moment they are challenged, the activist immediately retreats to the moat, which is the highly defensible, universally accepted claim. They'll retreat and say, "What do you mean? We don't want supremacy, we just want equality. Don't you believe men and women should be equal?"
I see.
Right. Because equality is a universally respected and defensible concept, the person who made the challenge is suddenly made to look like a bigot or reactionary. But here's the trick. As soon as the challenger backs off, the activist leaves the safe moat and goes right back down into the bailey to continue advancing the radical agenda.
And he says this is happening everywhere.
Riker asserts that this exact tactic is how our modern institutions were quietly captured. Whenever men complained about biased family courts or anti-male school curriculums or discriminatory HR policies, they were met with the mode of, "Oh, we're just pursuing equality." But the Bailey, the actual institutional bias being installed, was continually reinforced behind the scenes.
Let me make sure I'm tracking the logic here. He's saying that the language of equality is essentially a Trojan horse. And because of this, he argues we need to completely abandon the word patriarchy.
Yes, completely discard it.
He says a system that favors men hasn't existed in decades, which is a massive departure from mainstream sociology. Instead, he introduces this term, gynocracy. How does he define that? And what is the underlying foundation for it? Because he grounds this really heavily in evolutionary biology, doesn't he?
Yes, the evolutionary biology argument is the absolute bedrock of his thesis. Riker defines the gynocracy as rule by sentiment, emotion, and female privilege. He argues that this is the actual operating system governing our modern institutions. He posits that you simply cannot socialize away millions of years of evolutionary wiring.
Which makes sense from a purely biological standpoint.
Right. According to the text, men are biologically driven toward hierarchy, competition, risk-taking, and physical provision. Women, conversely, have entirely different biological imperatives centered around different survival strategies. Riker's core argument is that the gynocracy attempts to operate as if these biological realities do not exist.
It just ignores them.
It ignores them, it passes laws, and creates corporate policies that treat human nature as a blank slate, assuming people can be endlessly molded by HR departments and sensitivity training.
So when men inevitably fail to conform to a system that ignores their biology, what happens?
That is exactly when the gynocracy labels them toxic or defective. Riker uses the famous red pill metaphor here, but he treats it as a literal awakening, not just an internet buzzword. He's asking the reader to wake up and realize that the profound discomfort, the anxiety, or the alienation they feel in modern society isn't because there was something fundamentally wrong with them.
It's the system.
It's because they are living in a system that was explicitly designed to suppress their fundamental nature. He frames this realization as a revolution of awareness.
Revolution of awareness.
Okay.
If this overarching gynocracy is the operating system, how does it manifest in the real world? Let's transition into how he views specific institutions, starting with modern dating, marriage, and the family courts.
This section is intense.
Riker's assessment here is brutal. He refers to modern marriage as plantation economics, where the husband is essentially liquidated as an asset. But before we get to the courts, let's look at how people even end up married today. The book describes the modern dating market as a Ponzi scheme. That's a heavy financial accusation to level at romance. How does the text justify that comparison?
To understand the Ponzi scheme analogy, you have to look at how Riker connects evolutionary psychology to modern technology, specifically dating apps. Relying on cross-cultural evolutionary research, he asserts that men and women have entirely different timelines for peak desirability. The data he cites suggests that women hit their peak desirability very early, typically in their early to mid-20s. Men, on the other hand, generally do not hit their peak until their late 30s or early 40s, and only after they have acquired resources, status, and stability.
Okay, so the timelines are staggered. How does that turn into a Ponzi scheme?
Riker argues that modern dating apps allow young women to massively leverage their early peak to extract attention, free meals, and validation from an enormous global pool of men. Meanwhile, young men are told by society to be patient, to put their heads down, to work hard, and to build themselves.
Right, be the good guy.
Be the good guy. It becomes a Ponzi scheme because the young men doing the building, the early investors in the market, are almost always discarded. Riker introduces a concept here. He claims women hypergamously trade up.
Break that term down for me. What does hypergamously trade up actually mean in the context of the book's argument?
In layman's terms, hypergamy is the evolutionary instinct to mate with someone of higher status. Riker argues that women wait for the finished product, the older established man who has already built his wealth, rather than investing their youth in the young man who is still building his life.
Leaving the young guys with nothing.
Exactly. The young men at the bottom of the pyramid are the marks. They are investing time, money, and emotional energy into a dating system that offers them zero guarantee of a return on their investment.
Does the author provide concrete examples of what this looks like for the average guy? Because abstract theories are one thing, but how does this play out on the ground?
He provides a deeply illustrative anecdote about a man he calls James D. James is a 38-year-old successful surgeon. He earns a mid-six-figure salary, he drives a Tesla, he exercises, he does charity work.
He's the catch.
By every metric the mainstream culture provides, James is the definition of the finished product that men are told to become. Yet Riker details that James spent $40,000 on dating apps and matchmakers over a 3-year period.
$40,000 just to get a date.
Exactly. And the numbers get worse. James matched with over 1,200 women and went on 80 physical dates. But according to the book, not a single one of those dates turned into a committed relationship.
Oh.
Riker analyzes the why behind this. He claims that the absolute minute James brought up the concept of marriage, which is the biological and social outcome he was wired to desire, the women ghosted him. Riker's conclusion is that these women weren't actually looking for a life partner, they were mining for options.
Mining for options.
They were stringing James along to extract the emotional labor, the high-end dinners, and the validation, all while keeping their calendars open for a 45-year-old CEO with even more resources. The text uses James to paint a picture of men as entirely disposable stepping stones in the modern dating market.
So if a man manages to survive this Ponzi scheme and actually gets married, what happens when it falls apart? This brings us to the family court system, which the book views as the ultimate trap. You mentioned the term plantation economics earlier. How does Riker apply that to divorce?
The plantation economics metaphor is central to his critique of the courts. Riker argues that the moment a man enters family court, he ceases to be viewed by the state as a human being with rights. Instead, he is viewed purely as a financial asset.
A walking ATM.
Yes. His future labor is essentially captured and liquidated for the benefit of the mother and the state apparatus. The book details several cases that seemingly defy common sense to prove a darker point. Riker argues the system isn't broken or malfunctioning. It is functioning exactly as it was designed, to relentlessly extract male resources.
I want to dig into the specific cases he cites, because some of them sound unbelievable. Take the Robert Klein case from 2019 in New York.
Sure.
The book notes that Robert, an HVAC technician, was thrown in jail. Not for a violent crime, but for refusing to pay child support.
Right?
But the detail that stands out is that the child in question was 23 years old. He was married, living with his wife, and working full-time at a bank. How on earth does a legal system justify jailing a man for not supporting a married, fully employed 23-year-old?
According to Riker's deep dive into the legal mechanics of the case, it came down to a specific legal loophole regarding emancipation. The court held Robert in contempt because his son had never been officially legally emancipated by a judge's signature.
That's insane.
The physical reality of the situation, that the son was a fully independent married adult, was completely irrelevant to the court. The legal paperwork, the bureaucratic mechanism of extraction, was the only thing that mattered.
So the map became the territory. The paperwork overrode reality. What is Riker's takeaway from that?
Riker's uses the Klein case to argue that the family court system does not actually care about child welfare, which is the mot they retreat to when challenged. If the system truly cared about the child's welfare, it would look at the 23-year-old and see that he is perfectly fine.
Right, he's a married adult with a banking job.
Instead, the system wants cash flow. It views the father as a permanent debt slave. The book quotes Robert Klein as saying, "I guess I'm supposed to support him until he dies." Riker presents this not as an anomaly, but as a form of state-sanctioned extortion designed to punish the male.
State-sanctioned extortion. And the book claims this leads to some incredibly dark, hidden realities for men, right? He brings up the van life phenomenon. But we aren't talking about the glamorous Instagram influencer version of van life with fairy lights and a surfboard.
No, not at all. Riker points to a specific Reddit community, Marmella Van Life, which hosts around 1,200 men. The book cites a staggering statistic from this group. 68% of these men are living in their vehicles, specifically because divorce and the ensuing family court judgments completely obliterated their finances.
Wow.
They didn't choose this life for the adventure, they were forced into it for survival.
Does he profile anyone specific from that community? Because statistics are one thing, but the human element is what makes this real.
He profiles a man named Darren Klein. Darren was a senior software engineer, a high earner who was married for 14 years. After a brutal divorce, Darren now lives in a converted Sprinter van, which he explicitly refers to as his alimony-proof home.
Alimony-proof.
To meet his court-mandated obligations, he works 60 hours a week doing DoorDash and freelance coding on Fiverr. He does all of this just to afford the $3,200 a month he is mandated to pay in combined child support and alimony. By living in a van, Darren ensures that the state has no real estate, no major physical assets left to seize. Riker points out that this isn't freedom for Darren. It is a desperate survival tactic against a legal system that treats marriage like a hostile corporate takeover.
Okay, play devil's advocate using Riker's own framework for a moment. Society constantly hears about the deadbeat dad, the guy who just abandons his financial responsibilities out of pure selfishness. How does the book reconcile the deadbeat dad narrative with these claims of systemic extortion?
Riker completely dismantles the deadbeat dad myth using empirical data. He argues that the cultural narrative of the selfish father is just another tool of the gynocracy to justify extracting resources. He cites a highly detailed 2021 Urban Institute study. That study found that an astonishing 70% of unpaid child support is not due to a malicious refusal to pay. It is actually due to the father's unemployment or severe underemployment.
Wait, so the vast majority of men who aren't paying simply cannot pay?
Precisely. Yet, despite this data clearly showing a lack of ability to pay, the state routinely jails these men for the debt. Riker likens this to bringing back 18th century debtors' prisons, but applying them exclusively to men. The logic is entirely punitive. If you lose your job, you do not get a reprieve or a restructuring of your debt. You get a jail cell, which ironically makes it completely impossible to earn the money you owe. It proves, in Riker's eyes, that the cruelty is the point.
Let's take this a step further, because the financial bias is one thing, but the book claims the bias extends to the very concept of fatherhood and biological reality. Let's talk about the Robert Smith case in Texas, which deals with paternity fraud. Walk me through what happened there.
The Robert Smith case is perhaps the most infuriating example Riker provides. Robert paid $800 a month in child support for 15 years. He loved the child, he was actively involved. But then, a routine medical issue led to a DNA test. That test conclusively proved he was not the biological father. The mother had lied to him for a decade and a half.
So he takes this irrefutable DNA evidence to the judge. What does the court do? Surely they stop the payments and pursue the mother for fraud.
You would assume so, based on common sense. But when Robert took this to court, the judge essentially told him, tough luck. The court relied on a legal doctrine called equitable estoppel.
Okay, we need to pause and unpack that term. What exactly does equitable estoppel mean in plain English, and why does the book say it's biased?
In layman's terms, equitable estoppel is a legal principle that prevents a person from going back on their word or their past actions if someone else has relied on those actions. In the context of family court, the judge decided that because Robert had played the role of the father for 15 years, he had established a precedent. Therefore, he was permanently legally obligated to continue assuming the financial liability regardless of the biological truth or the mother's deception.
But wouldn't the court argue that this is about maintaining stability for the child? That breaking that bond would be traumatizing?
That is exactly the mot the court retreats to. But Riker argues that this exposes the ultimate hypocrisy of the system. The legal system will protect a woman's lie to guarantee that the man's financial resources remain accessible to her. It is literally called paternity fraud, yet the victim of the fraud, the man who is lied to, is the one who is punished with a lifetime of indentured servitude. Riker uses this to show that male biology and truth mean nothing to the state. Only male utility as a wallet matters.
And if the court claims it cares about the psychological bond between fathers and children to justify equitable estoppel, how does the system treat that bond in normal custody disputes?
This is where Riker introduces the tender years doctrine. He argues that family courts still operate on this unscientific, fossilized belief that young children inherently need their mothers more than their fathers. Even though laws in progressive states like California explicitly state that joint custody is presumed to be in the child's best interest, Riker points out that judges routinely bypass the law.
How do they get around it?
They do this by vaguely citing an unquantifiable emotional bond with the mother, thereby awarding her primary custody and consequently the child support checks.
And what happens when the mother weaponizes that bond? Roker talks about parental alienation, right?
Yes, and this is crucial. Parental alienation is a form of psychological abuse where one parent actively tries to destroy the child's relationship with the other parent. Riker points out that when mothers engage in this, courts largely ignore it. He argues that acknowledging parental alienation would require the gynocracy to admit something fundamentally forbidden, that mothers can be abusive, vindictive, and deceptive. This would violate the core societal tenet of female victimhood and maternal purity.
Does he have an example of the courts ignoring this?
He gives a chilling example of a California father. His ex-wife texted their young children daily, sending messages like, "Daddy is dangerous and Daddy wants to hurt us," until the kids were so terrified they stopped taking his calls entirely. The father took these texts to court to prove emotional abuse. The court did absolutely nothing. They wrote off the texts as the mother's emotional distress during a difficult transition. Meanwhile, the father was completely bankrupted by legal fees, trying to save his relationship with his kids, and he eventually lost them entirely.
The financial trap seems inescapable. He even mentions a law in New Jersey that allows courts to retroactively garnish up to 60% of a man's income going back to the child's birth, even if the man never knew he was a father. Just imagine waking up at 35 with a $90,000 bill because of a brief encounter in college. Riker is painting a picture of a legal system that isn't a neutral arbiter of justice, but a highly tuned machine designed to transfer wealth from men to women, enforced by the threat of violence and incarceration.
That's his exact argument.
If the family courts are where men lose their assets and your children, Riker seems to argue that the groundwork for that compliance is laid much earlier. Let's transition to his views on the education system and the mental health crisis. He claims that schools actively pathologize boyhood. What does he mean by that?
Rikers argues that the modern education system is entirely misaligned with the natural biology and psychology of boys. Schools, he claims, are meticulously designed to produce what he calls docile learners. A docile learner is a child who sits still, colors inside the lines, listens quietly without interrupting, and strictly conforms to the group dynamic.
And based on the evolutionary framework we discussed earlier, boys don't fit that mold.
Exactly. The problem, according to Riker's premise, is that boys are not naturally docile. They are biologically wired to be energetic, to explore their environment physically, to compete with one another, and to constantly challenge boundaries. But instead of accommodating this natural energy, perhaps with more recess, hands-on learning, or competitive structures, the system views this energy as a disease.
It's treated as a pathology.
Natural male energy is swiftly diagnosed as ADHD and medicated away. Natural confidence is labeled as arrogance. The innate desire to compete and win is deemed toxic masculinity. Riker argues that the modern classroom is no longer a meritocracy based on academic achievement. It is a compliance training facility that heavily favors female behavioral norms.
This reminds me of the story he tells about the physics teacher in Ohio. Walk me through that, because it perfectly illustrates what happens when raw male output clashes with compliance training.
Yeah, it is an incredibly frustrating anecdote. The book details a high school physics teacher in Ohio who had a brilliant male student. During an independent study block, this student managed to independently derive Newton's laws of motion from first principles. This is absolute genius level college read work for a high schooler, but the teacher was forced by the curriculum rubrics to mark the kid down.
Why? If you prove the math, what was the issue?
Because the student refused to participate in the mandatory group reflection circle about the project. His actual brilliant, solitary output mattered less to the grading system than his refusal to engage in an emotional, collaborative, highly socialized exercise. Riker uses this specific example to show how intellectual excellence in boys is actively suppressed and penalized if it doesn't conform to feminized collective behavioral standards.
It seems like that's just a byproduct of a bad rubric, though. Does Riker think this is an active ideological conditioning process?
He absolutely does, and he claims it starts incredibly early and can be overtly hostile. He points to school districts across the country that are rolling out mandatory male privilege modules for young students. He cites a specific curriculum utilized in Seattle where young, elementary-aged boys were instructed to write apology letters to the girls in their class simply for taking up space.
Wait, they weren't apologizing for bullying or bad behavior, just for existing.
Just for existing as boys. Riker argues the message is systematically implanted from kindergarten. Female identity is inherently oppressed and therefore automatically virtuous, while male identity is inherently oppressive and therefore requires constant apology, self-diminishment, and atonement.
What happens when a society takes that to its absolute logical extreme?
For that, Riker points to Sweden. Sweden went full tilt into a nationwide gender-neutral education experiment in their preschools. They banned gendered language entirely. Teachers were forbidden from saying boys or girls, referring to everyone only as friends, or using a newly invented gender-neutral pronoun. They removed all toy guns, all competitive games, and praised only genderless expression.
And what was the result of trying to engineer gender out of children?
According to the data Riker cites, it was a disaster for the boys. Boys' literacy scores in those specific schools plummeted by 18% in just a 5-year window. Riker's commentary on this is sharp. He writes, "When nature fights back, ideology loses. You can't raise warriors on lullabies and then wonder why they won't fight."
That's quite a quote.
And the macro results of this system across the West are chilling. He cites statistics showing that women now earn 58% of all college degrees, while men make up only 43% of college graduates. The education system isn't just failing boys by accident. Riker argues it is leaving them behind by design.
If the schools are breaking boys down, how does that manifest when they become adults? This leads directly into what Riker calls the feminist double bind. I know he spends all of Chapter 6 on this. Can you explain what a double bind is and how he applies it to men's mental health?
A double bind is a psychological concept where a person is given two conflicting demands, making success or obedience impossible. Whatever choice you make, you are punished. Society, Riker argues, places men in a lethal double bind. On one hand, society demands that men be killers for the state when necessary. They are expected to fight the wars, to do the grueling, dangerous jobs that keep the lights on, and to be the stoic heroes who run into burning buildings when a crisis hits. Civilization relies entirely on male aggression, physical strength, and self-sacrifice for its very survival.
That's the historical role. What is the conflicting demand?
The second part of the bind is that, in everyday peaceful life, society aggressively punishes those exact same traits. It medicates male aggression into numbness in schools. It labels their natural confidence as toxic in the workplace. It demands they be emotionally vulnerable, passive, and communicative.
But they can't actually do that, can they?
No, and this is the crux of the trap. When men do show vulnerability, when they do cry or ask for help, they are immediately mocked as weak, whiny, or unmanly by both women and the institutions that demanded they open up in the first place. They are expected to absorb abuse silently, serve the system, and stay quiet.
That sounds incredibly isolating. Yeah. How does the book quantify the toll this takes on men?
He illustrates the lethality of this double bind with devastating statistics regarding the mental health crisis and physical danger. Society operates on the narrative that men hold all the systemic privilege, but Riker points out that the empirical reality of male suffering completely contradicts this. He cites that the male suicide rate is 3.6 times higher than the female rate. Suicide rates for divorced fathers, tying back to the family court section, are 5 times higher than for divorced mothers. Men hold 93% of the most dangerous jobs in America. We're talking about coal mining, high-rise roofing, commercial fishing, combat roles. Consequently, men account for 97% of all workplace fatalities.
Men are quite literally dying to keep civilization running. So how does the system respond to these crises? Do the resources match the mortality rates?
That is the most damning part of his argument. Despite these overwhelming, undeniable crises of male death and despair, Riker notes that 90% of federal mental health grants are directed specifically toward women and girls. He labels this systemic warfare. The overarching system extracts male labor and male life to build and maintain the infrastructure, but outright refuses to allocate resources to heal the trauma it inflicts upon them. He argues it is a completely disposable view of male life.
Let me see if I can anticipate the author's logic here. Why would the system ignore the data? Is it just malice or is it structural?
Riker believes it is structural necessity. He argues the gynocracy only values men for their utility as resources to be taxed or protectors to be deployed. Once a man ceases to be useful, or once he is injured and needs help himself, he becomes invisible. Furthermore, the overarching narrative of female victimhood is the central pillar of the gynocracy's power. If the institutions were to acknowledge the male suicide crisis or the workplace fatality disparity, it would require dismantling the foundational myth of universal male privilege. They cannot allow the data on male suffering to disrupt the narrative of female oppression, so the suffering is simply ignored.
Okay, we've seen how Riker views the destruction of men in marriage and in the schools. So let's look at the men who survive all of that and enter the workforce. Let's transition to the corporate world, what he calls the corporate woke coup, and the phenomenon of the beta uprising. The book argues that the corporate boardroom is no longer about profit or meritocracy. If it isn't about making money, what is it about?
According to chapters 14 through 17, the corporate world has been entirely captured by what Riker terms the diversity industrial complex. This is a vast, interconnected network of HR enforcers, diversity consultants, and compliance officers whose entire existence relies on policing speech and behavior rather than driving actual revenue or building better products.
So power has shifted from the engineers and the salesmen to the HR department.
Exactly. Riker posits that real power in the modern corporation has shifted away from the executives driving profit and into the hands of those who police ideological purity. He provides a stark example involving a highly competent, top-performing software architect at IBM.
What about them?
This employee had a spotless record, brilliant performance reviews, and was crucial to his team. However, during a mandatory company-wide male accountability workshop, he simply raised his hand and questioned the premise of the training. He calmly expressed that it felt less like professional development and more like political indoctrination. He didn't yell, he didn't insult anyone, he just questioned the framework. For merely questioning the premise, he was fired.
Just fired on the spot for asking a question. Did he fight it?
He did, and he eventually settled a wrongful termination lawsuit for $1.2 million. But Riker points out that the financial settlement doesn't matter to the diversity industrial complex. The message was successfully sent to the entire company. Ideology trumps merit. You can be the absolute best at your job, you can generate millions in revenue, but if you do not submit to the dogma, you will be purged.
And the book details how these internal enforcement mechanisms work, right? It's not just random firings. There are organized structures. Look at what he says happened at Uber.
The Uber example is fascinating. Riker writes that Uber, in an attempt to appease public pressure, created an internal culture squad. This squad was given unprecedented authority to investigate senior executives for any perceived cultural infractions. But here's the catch. The squad was made up entirely of non-managers, and it was overwhelmingly composed of women and minorities.
What did this culture squad actually accomplish?
In a single year, they launched formal investigations into 17 senior executives. All 17 of the executives investigated were men. 0 women or minorities were investigated. Riker calls this a kangaroo court with a predetermined target list. He uses this to illustrate an environment where men are forced to walk on eggshells, constantly aware that one misinterpreted comment, one joke, or one anonymous accusation can end their entire career with absolutely no due process.
But here's where the book takes a really sharp, almost psychological turn. It would be easy for Riker to just blame women or feminist activists for this corporate culture, but he doesn't. He actually aims a massive amount of his venom at other men, specifically male feminists and corporate allies. He calls this the beta uprising. What is the psychology behind the beta uprising?
This is a crucial, defining part of Riker's analysis. He asks a fundamental question. How did a system so hostile to men gain such absolute control over male-dominated spaces like tech and corporate boardrooms? His answer is that weak men, whom he categorizes evolutionarily as betas, actively facilitated the hostile takeover.
Why would men help build a system that ultimately harms men?
Riker argues that these men are acutely aware that they cannot compete with alpha men on the traditional grounds of physical strength, raw competence, charisma, or leadership. Because they cannot win the traditional game, they attempt a different strategy to gain social status and female attention. They adopt and ruthlessly enforce feminist ideology.
To what end?
Well, Riker calls them the immune system of female supremacy. They attack other men from within the organization to prove their loyalty to the gynocracy. Their psychological motivation is the belief that by loudly denouncing toxic masculinity and signaling their virtue, they will be rewarded with sex, romance, and respect from women.
Okay, play devil's advocate again. If these beta men are doing this to get a romantic return on investment, does it actually work? Because Riker leans heavily on data. What does the data say about the male feminist strategy?
Rikers argues they are completely deluding themselves, and he pulls out a devastating 2022 Stanford study to prove it. This study looked at the social and romantic outcomes of men who loudly identify as allies. The study found that men who publicly denounce masculinity are 3.2 times more likely to get social invitations from female-dominated circles.
So they get invited to the brunches, the book clubs, the HR mixers.
Yeah.
They get proximity.
Yes, they gain immense social proximity. But, and this is the massive, undeniable but that destroys their strategy, the study found they see a 0% increase in sexual intimacy with those women. None. Statistically 0. Riker says they are essentially acting as the pet intellectuals of the sorority house. They are kept around for validation and labor, but they are still sleeping alone.
The anecdotes he uses to illustrate this are brutal. He tells the story of a guy he calls Chad the Conchu.
Correct. Tell me about Chad. The book describes Chad at a house party. Chad spends his entire evening smugly lecturing a room full of people about proper pronoun usage in the patriarchy, desperately trying to impress a specific woman in the group. He is performing the ultimate beta ally routine. But 5 minutes later, Riker notes, the woman Chad was trying to impress is seen texting the bouncer of a local club. A quiet, heavily tattooed, muscular guy who hadn't spoken a single word of politics all night. She leaves the party with the bouncer.
What is Riker's evolutionary analysis of that interaction?
Riker's analysis is that women do not actually reward public moralizing, or what he calls beta values. Evolutionarily, they reward quiet confidence, physical presence, and competence. They are biologically attracted to the man who is indifferent to the ideological rules, not the neurotic man who enforces them.
He also mentions a Reddit moderator, you beta savior 23. That story is just sad.
It is. This moderator ran a massive men's rights forum, but he ran it specifically to ban anyone who actually supported men. He thought he was being a revolutionary feminist ally, shielding women from toxic masculinity on the internet. He threw a birthday party for himself and invited all the women from his supposed ideological circle that he had been protecting.
Did anyone show up?
Not a single woman showed up. The only people who came were his mom, his roommate, and a teaching assistant who was just dropping by to pick up a book. It perfectly illustrates the zero return on investment for the beta male.
So, if we apply this back to the corporate world, if women aren't actually attracted to these male allies and they don't respect them, why do they keep them around in HR departments and diversity committees? Why give them power?
Riker introduces a brilliant distinction here. He argues that women want beta labor, not beta values. In the corporate environment, the gynocracy needs its ideological rules enforced. But women, generally speaking, do not want to do the dirty, highly confrontational, aggressive work of policing speech and firing people themselves. It goes against their desire for social harmony. So they utilize the desperate beta males to do the aggressive moral policing for them.
The betas are the attack dogs.
Exactly. The betas act as virtue shields. When the inevitable backlash comes against these oppressive anti-merit policies, when lawsuits are filed or the company loses millions, it's the beta male HR manager who takes the hit and gets fired. Meanwhile, the overarching structure of the gynocracy remains completely intact and shielded from blame. Riker concludes that these betas trade their dignity and betray their own gender for crumbs of attention, and ultimately, they learn they are just as disposable as any other man in the system.
Wow. It is a bleak, ruthless, incredibly cynical view of both corporate dynamics and intersexual relations. If we accept the author's premise, the system is rigged from top to bottom. The dating market is a Ponzi scheme, the courts will bankrupt you, the schools will drug you, and your male coworkers will sell you out for a pat on the head from HR. So where does that leave the listener? If the game is entirely rigged, why play?
That's the million-dollar question.
This brings us to the climax of the book, Section 5, the solution. Riker calls it the alpha reclamation. His message to men is very simple and incredibly radical. He says, stop asking for permission. Stop begging the system for fairness because the system is designed to exploit you. You have to start building entirely outside of it. How does he categorize the men who are actually doing this?
Riker introduces a concept that serves as the foundation for his solution, the sovereignty gap. He argues that there is an accelerating, unbridgeable divide between two types of men in the modern world. On one side, you have the creators. These are men who build tangible value, who own their own labor, who operate outside of corporate structures, and who lead without asking anyone for approval. On the other side, you have the compliers. Men who follow the rules, who seek validation from the system, who wait for promotions that will never come, and who ultimately get discarded.
And his argument is that being a complier is no longer a viable survival strategy.
Precisely. Riker argues that the era of the complier is dead. You can no longer work hard, keep your head down in a corporate job, be a good citizen, and expect a fair shake in return. The system will bleed you dry. The only path forward for a man to retain his dignity, his sanity, and his resources is to cross the sovereignty gap and become a creator. He must learn to operate completely outside the ideological constraints and the jurisdictional reach of the gynocracy.
He provides some truly incredible examples of men living this permissionless life. Let's talk about Cody Reeder. This guy is the ultimate creator in Riker's eyes. What did he do?
Cody Reeder is a fascinating case study in bypassing gatekeepers. He is a guy who built a working nuclear fusion reactor in his backyard in Utah.
A nuclear reactor in his backyard. Did he have a massive university grant?
No. He didn't have a PhD, he didn't get grants from a university diversity committee, he didn't ask a board of ethics for approval, he just used YouTube tutorials, sourced the parts himself, and built it. Now, because he documented the process, he has a massive YouTube channel, makes 6 figures independently, and speaks at major energy conferences. Riker uses Cody to prove a point. Cody didn't ask the gatekeepers if he was allowed to be a genius, he just produced the results. The system couldn't stop him because he didn't rely on it.
Then there is the West Texas welder. This is an entirely different kind of sovereignty. Paint a picture of this guy's life.
The West Texas welder is Riker's archetype for physical and financial off-grid independence. This man bought cheap land and built a 1,200 square foot homestead entirely from scrap metal. He grows his own food, he runs his property on solar panels, and he makes $180,000 a year selling custom steel sculptures online. He operates almost entirely in cash and crypto. He is completely untaxed and unregulated.
What happened when the system tried to reel him back in?
The book recounts a story where a local county bureaucrat came out to his off-grid property to try and shut him down for lacking proper building permits. The welder didn't get angry. He didn't hire a lawyer to fight the system. He simply looked at the bureaucrat and said, "I don't live in your world. Try arresting the wind." He understood that the bureaucrat had zero actual leverage over him. The system was irrelevant. That, Riker argues, is the ultimate definition of male sovereignty.
And Riker scales this concept up, right? He doesn't just look at guys in the desert. He looks at high-profile cultural figures that the manosphere reveres. Let's talk about how he analyzes Andrew Tate. Because Tate is obviously a highly controversial figure, but Riker looks at him mechanically, right?
Yes. Riker sets aside any moral judgment of Tate's lifestyle or current legal troubles to analyze the mechanics of his success. Tate was systematically banned from every major social media platform, debanked, and vilified by the mainstream press. Yet, despite being completely exiled by the Matrix, he built a digital empire estimated to be worth $500 million from a compound in Romania.
How did he do it without the platforms?
By building parallel structures. He built his own camera setups, leased his own independent servers, and created decentralized, affiliate-based marketing networks that couldn't be shut down by a single CEO in Silicon Valley. Riker argues that the establishment doesn't hate Tate because he's a misogynist or because he's dangerous. They hate him because he empirically proved that a man doesn't need their permission, their platforms, or their approval to become a billionaire. He exists entirely outside their control, which terrifies them.
He makes a similar point about Jordan Peterson, right? Bypassing the traditional gatekeepers of intellectualism.
Exactly. When Peterson wrote 12 Rules for Life, traditional publishers wanted to heavily edit the content to align with modern sensibilities. Peterson refused. He self-published and used the internet and long-form podcasts to sell 5 million copies via direct-to-consumer word of mouth. He completely bypassed the literary gatekeepers. And of course, Riker points to Elon Musk, who builds literal rockets and electric cars while openly mocking and ignoring the dictates of social justice NGOs and corporate media.
Riker sums this up with a brilliant line. Permission is a tax on greatness.
It is the core ethos of the Alpha Reclamation. Every time you ask a boss for a raise, a government for a permit, or a cultural arbiter for approval, you are negotiating for scraps from a table you didn't build. Riker's command to men is simple. Stop negotiating. Build your own table.
And he backs this command up with hard economic data, not just internet anecdotes. He cites a Kauffman Foundation report regarding entrepreneurship. What did that report find about the guys who actually succeed?
The Kauffman report found that 83% of high-growth startups, meaning companies that hit over $1 million in revenue within their first 3 years, are founded by men under the age of 40 who have no formal business education. They don't have MBAs, they don't have Ivy League pedigrees, they're just men taking risks and executing aggressively outside the traditional credentialed paths.
He also cites a Harvard study about financial independence.
Yes, the Harvard study notes that men who start their own businesses before the age of 35 are 3.2 times more likely to achieve total financial independence by the age of 45 compared to men who stay in the corporate ladder.
So the data supports the exit strategy. Based on all of this, what is the specific tactical advice Riker gives to his readers in the manosphere? If a guy is listening to this and wants to start the Alpha Reclamation, what are the steps?
Riker's tactical advice is incredibly concrete. First, delay marriage indefinitely. Do not enter into a legal contract where the state has a financial incentive to ruin you. Second, secure your assets. Move wealth into crypto, precious metals, or off-grid real estate that cannot be easily seized by a family court. Third, prioritize brotherhood. Build tight-knit male networks that are not based on therapy, vulnerability, or submission, but on building, investing, and winning together. Fourth, start a side hustle immediately. Learn to fix cars, write code, flip houses, or sell digital products. Riker writes that the very first dollar you earn entirely outside the corporate W-2 system is the first brick in your fortress of sovereignty.
Let's bring this all together. What this ultimately leads to is a complete redefinition of what male privilege actually is. The mainstream narrative tells us that male privilege is holding the corner office, or sitting on the board of a Fortune 500 company, or being a politician. How does Riker redefine privilege in the context of the Alpha Reclamation?
Riker argues that the men in the corner offices aren't privileged at all. They are high-paid slaves to the diversity industrial complex. They live in constant fear because they can be fired and have their reputations destroyed for a single wrong word or a bad PR cycle. They have no actual power. Real male privilege, according to Riker, is biological and psychological. It is the capacity to simply walk away.
The power of the exit.
Precisely. It is the ability to endure physical hardship, to go off-grid, to build something tangible with your own hands, a house, an engine, a server network that cannot be legislated away by HR or seized by a family court judge. He asserts that the true hidden power of men is that society relies entirely on their labor, their taxes, and their infrastructure to survive. If the men who build and maintain the world collectively decide to stop playing a rigged game, to stop seeking the approval of the gynocracy, and instead focus entirely their energy on building their own parallel structures, the existing system will simply collapse under its own bureaucratic weight.
Because it produces nothing. It only extracts.
Exactly. The Alpha Reclamation isn't about protesting in the streets or begging the government to pass fairer laws. It is about quietly withdrawing consent, labor, and resources from a system that fundamentally hates you.
What an incredibly intense, uncompromising journey through Conrad Riker's worldview. We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We looked at his premise of the matrix and the gynocracy, and how the concept of equality has been weaponized through Mott and Bailey tactics to psychologically disarm men. We waded through the brutal statistics and the heartbreaking stories of the family courts, the alimony traps, the paternity fraud, and the men driven to live in vans to escape state-sanctioned extortion. We examine the education system's war on boyish energy and the deadly double bind that demands male sacrifice while entirely ignoring male suffering. We unpack the corporate woke coup and the pathetic zero ROI reality of the beta uprising. And finally, we looked at the Alpha Reclamation, the radical call for men to stop asking for permission, to bridge the sovereignty gap, and to start building their own parallel empires in the real world. We must acknowledge the sheer weight, the density, and the fascinating incisiveness of the material we reviewed today. It is a sweeping, controversial, and fundamentally radical reframing of how our modern institutions operate.
It really is. It is a thesis that demands attention, regardless of whether you agree with its premises or find them abhorrent. Riker is articulating a deep systemic frustration felt by a significant and growing portion of the male population. By framing the history of our institutions as a deliberate process of capture and weaponization, he provides a cohesive and highly combative lens through which his audience can interpret their struggles. The concept of withdrawing from mainstream institutions to build parallel, permissionless lives is a powerful psychological tool for those who feel marginalized and exploited by modern society.
I want to tell you directly, the listener, if you found this breakdown as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did, and you want to dive into the full, uncensored manifesto for yourself, you must check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Leftist Wolf Whistles. You truly need to read the source text to grasp the full intensity and the granular detail of his arguments. Furthermore, if you want to follow the author for his ongoing uncensored content, you need to subscribe to his Substack at conradriker.com. You can also find him on Twitter at @ConradRiker and on YouTube at @ConradRiker. Do not miss his continuing work. And please remember to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive right now so we can keep bringing you these incredibly detailed explorations of the world's most fascinating and impactful sources. As we conclude, let's connect everything we've discussed back to the broader implications of Riker's manifesto. He is urging a mass exodus of competent, driven men from the foundational institutions of society. This raises a critical, existential question about the future of our civilization. Exactly. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. If this sovereignty gap continues to widen, and if millions of the most driven, capable men actually heed Riker's call, if they completely opt out of mainstream corporate America, abandon the traditional education system, and refuse to participate in the institution of marriage in order to build their own parallel, off-grid empires, what does the mainstream society they leave behind actually look like 50 years from now? Can a civilization sustain itself when its builders decide they no longer wish to participate? Think about that. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.